Okay, let's see if we can start making just a little bit of sense out of all of this, shall we? Hey guys, this is Jules with True Crime Reactions. As you guys know, I've been trying a really long time now to try to get an idea about when the cops actually had full eyes on Bryan Kohberger. I want to try to figure out exactly the steps that were taken for them to make the trip all the way to Pennsylvania for all of the things that we know happened thereafter. And it's been really confusing because for a long time, people didn't even believe that there was any sort of genealogical testing that was done. And then we started getting documents from both the defense and the state when it comes to them now wanting to talk about it, with the state trying to also exclude it from trial. Now, the video I posted yesterday was a very short segment in an almost 33-minute long video that I have now condensed and apparently split into two separate videos. And in that was the verbiage that Dawn Daniels, whenever she did the WSU warrant in order for Bryan's apartment and office to be searched, from the information that she received from ISB and Moscow PD, she took it upon herself to put a supplemental discovery statement regarding the genealogical testing that premeditated what is now happening. But that information was found while I was doing this research. So now what we're going to do is go through the entire timeline from the very beginning, because like I said, I am trying to figure out exactly when the genealogical testing took place when it comes to the way that the warrants were dated. This is another one of those situations where I've taken several different sources of paths and timelines that we've been given in this case and mashed them all together into the correct chronological order. So let's just go ahead and get started. We know that the murders took place on November 13th. Now, one thing that I've questioned a lot is the way that the PCA puts the timeline for the event. Now, it states that per the roommates' phones, they are giving the timeline of between 4 a.m. and 4:25 a.m. But then when it comes to the vehicle, they claim the vehicle left the area speeding away at 4:20 a.m. So I've always questioned that additional 5 minutes that they're giving it based on the roommates' cell phones when we know that that 911 call was delayed for so long. It's just always been a question. And yeah, it's only 5 minutes. But whenever they're trying to claim that he went in here like ninja style with one weapon and took out 4 people, including a man that was bigger than him, in the middle of the night, most likely in the dark, on 2 separate floors in like under 9 minutes, that additional little 5 minutes kind of matters. So it's important to me. It wasn't until a few days later, on November 16th, that Detective Maury got the warrant for the AT&T tower information, and he received that back on 11/17. Now, the next day, on the 18th, is whenever we're told that Bryan transferred his vehicle information from Pennsylvania over to Washington, because remember, they're claiming that at the time this happened, he still had his Pennsylvania plates, which meant he only had the one plate. And they're claiming in the PCA that the vehicle on the cameras matched that kind of description with just one plate, but they've yet to show us evidence of that, so I digress. Now, on November 29th is whenever they actually get their first tidbit of information on Bryan, according to the PCA, but this is where my questions really start. So on 11/29 at 12:28 a.m., so barely after midnight, you guys, is whenever the officer at WSU searched the database and found Bryan's vehicle registered to one that was on the lookout, according to Moscow PD, okay? A whole separate officer sees the exact same vehicle in the Steptoe parking lot. And on this date, on 11/29, after 12:58 in the morning, okay, again, fresh after midnight practically, they are running the plate, they are getting his information, they are seeing his photograph, they are pulling the fact that he had a traffic stop in Moscow on August the 21st, and they have his phone number on 11/29, okay? Now, the last day of school before Christmas break was on December the 9th, and the last day for finals was on December the 12th. I don't know what the PhD program entails, if there's exams at this point or not for certain classes. I don't know, but I'm still including that because we don't know what his actual academic and employment status was at the schools because we've been unable to get anything verified. Now, it's on 12/13 that the license plate reader picks up Bryan's Washington plates in Colorado. I went back and spent a majority of today trying to find the exact date that he left. And the last day of school was on 12/9. And he was in Colorado being scanned by 12/13. And I'm going to assume that probably meant that he would have left on the 9th or the 10th because Colorado wasn't just like an hour away. You know what I mean? I found some interesting information on the trip that his dad would have taken to go and meet up with him anyway. And I'm pretty sure other people have talked about this, but I hadn't, and I didn't know the specifics of this. So according to this article in Newsweek, whatever, they're claiming that Bryan's dad flew from Pennsylvania to Seattle and then basically drove from Spokane to Pullman. Okay. So when I looked up flights, they do have like nonstop flights from Pennsylvania, Albrightsville area to Seattle. And then they have flights from Seattle to Spokane. So I'm going to assume that he had to take a connecting flight, which is why they labeled it like that. But then he would have rented a car and drove his rental car to his son's house instead of Bryan just going and picking him up at the airport, knowing they have to do this like long road trip, and dad getting a rental car to drive to Pullman means that they then have an additional step to do before they can leave town, which would be dropping off the rental car. I just found that a little strange because that's another step, like I mentioned, having to drop off the rental car that his dad would have gotten in Spokane. But then it also kind of made me wonder if it was done that way, if Bryan gave his dad an excuse for it to be done that way, because Bryan didn't want his car seen by like airport security cameras, because those flag for anything and everything. And by then the airports definitely would have had the information that was actually being sent out to law enforcement when it comes to the suspect, which would be deeper, more detailed information than what the public had. So I know this is a little bit of a tangent off the subject a little, but it was interesting to see the steps taken if this was accurate. And apparently this information came from one of the public defenders in an interview back on January the 1st. So take that for what it is. I just find it all a little unnecessary, I guess. So then we jump from the license plate reader picking up the plate in Colorado on 12/13 to the double traffic stops on 12/15 in Indiana. Now look, I know there's a huge discrepancy on if this was orchestrated or not, and for a while I really thought it was. And I believe that even whenever me and Dago were on Drunk Turkey Show last week, that I even mentioned that I still believed it was orchestrated, and there was reasons. For one, seriously, pretty much back-to-back stops, and you don't get a ticket. Okay, you don't get license and registration looked over. Your name isn't asked for. These two stops are the most abnormally done protocol-wise situations that I have literally ever seen. Okay, so while the FBI is claiming no responsibility for any of it, they are not the only organization, A, working this case then or now, and B, they are not the only organization with the power to team up with other agencies to orchestrate things. So if it was orchestrated, I'm pretty sure those details will be brought out at some point, but there's reasons why I kind of don't believe that they were even looking at him then. Okay, so when it comes to the AT&T warrants for the cell phones, all they did was pull the tower warrant the first time, okay? And then whenever they had the car on 11/29 and pulled the information for the traffic stop and they had his phone number, they didn't do anything too specific then, okay? It wasn't until 12/23, okay, like almost 10 days after the traffic stops, that they finally did a warrant for Bryan Kohberger's specific information for his AT&T account, okay? And one thing that Daniel with Drunk Turkey Show did mention is that he believes, and I do believe that he is ex-law enforcement, so this is his take on it, looking at this with his point of view, that on 11/29, when they got Bryan Kohberger's information with the phone number from the traffic stop, that they probably compared it to the information that they got from the original tower warrant, and because his number wasn't on there originally, they probably just pushed it off to the side and didn't pay too much attention to it, okay? And that would technically explain why he would have been allowed to even leave state to begin with, because look, man, this is a quadruple homicide investigation. They were going to look really, really bad if they technically knew he was the guy or had huge convictions that he was the guy prior to him leaving Pullman, and they just let him leave. And there was days and days in between where they have no information of them tracking him because they lost him. And that is one of the things that we did originally here, that they lost him for a few days. So I don't know if they're trying to backtrack so they can take away responsibility for that, or if they really didn't know. I don't think they knew on 12/15, but the traffic stops are still so strange that it's hard to tell. 12/16 is apparently whenever Bryan and his dad actually got all the way back to Pennsylvania. But these are the questions I have for this, because if the dateline source is accurate whatsoever, the biggest question that we've had in this entire time is the genealogy. The prosecution, the people trying to put Bryan Kohberger basically in front of a firing squad, are planning on filing a motion of limine in order for the sheath DNA, the genealogical testing done on the sheath DNA, let me verbiage that correctly, the genealogical testing done on the sheath DNA, not the DNA itself, not the technical results of matching it to Bryan himself from his own blood sample or DNA sample to the sheath itself, okay? But the genealogical testing done before his arrest. That motion will exclude that from being admissible in court. And in that point is what my biggest issue with this has been from the time that we heard that that was happening. According to the Bloom article, they found nothing originally. Whoever searched for anything on the sheath, which technically would mean Idaho State Police Lab, found nothing, okay? But the PCAs are telling us they are the ones that found the touch DNA. Well, if the Bloom article and technically the Dateline sources have any factualness to them whatsoever, they would have only found 20 to 25 cells of touch DNA. Okay, for one, that right there, that is barely even enough to do adequate testing for, because these things are not just ran through testing one time. There's multiple tests that have to be done on the exact same type of sample, and it has to be a certain accuracy for it to even be considered as valid. Now, as most of you guys know, it's been about a decade since I was in school for this stuff, so I can only remember so much, but I found a very well written comment on Reddit mixed with some knowledge and emotion, so you can tell it's somebody who is versed in the subject, that's following the case, and has very strong opinions about it. But I wanted to read it because it gives you a really good layout of the way that these tests are done. So this is from someone that goes by the name of Excellent Dog 7784. I've worked as a lab technician in a genetics research lab for the past 12 years. We have the newest, most sophisticated equipment money can buy. We work mainly with parental-based tagging, PBT, and genetic stock index, GSI. We extract DNA from fresh tissues/samples, so I have more than a little experience with DNA analysis. The technicians in our lab, including myself, laugh our asses off when the subject of touch DNA comes up in this case, and I've mentioned that to you guys. In the hierarchy of DNA, touch DNA is like the court jester, okay? You can't really take touch DNA too serious, like, at all. Rerun samples 3 times to get accuracy to above 98%. Then there is the QA/QC process, which is an additional 2 more runs. All of these runs use a fresh sample. There is no effing way they had enough sample to accurately process the touch DNA. And why did they need to follow him to Pennsylvania to collect his father's DNA if they already had it? Why didn't they just collect the suspect's DNA in Pullman from his garbage? Which I have said that. Why couldn't they have just done a search warrant excluding the genealogy, okay, like they claim that they need to do? If everything else that they had on him was so concrete and valid, then why couldn't they have just gotten a search warrant to search his office and his apartment without them having to follow him all the way across the country on a maybe or a what if? And honestly, without that match, I don't even know if we would have an arrest at this point. I mean, honestly, we don't know what else they have, but what they're presenting, I'm not confident in, which is why we're here. This person also goes on to state, also, the state crime lab in Idaho is not lacking the technology. The idea that the lab in Texas has access to a database of individuals that a crime lab doesn't have is preposterous. Yeah, I agree. If I were the defense counsel, I would ask for chain of custody of the sheath as it traveled from Idaho to Texas, and as many I's and T's that we know that Ann Taylor likes to dot and cross. I'm pretty positive that she's going to expect to have paper trails for every single lab that touched this thing. There's no doubt about it. There are 2 warrants that are public access right now on the official Idaho site for this case. One from Coeur d'Alene that has legitimately 0 information on it. It is literally just the motion and approval for it to be sealed. There's nothing about who obtained it, when it was issued, if or when the information was received back. There's absolutely nothing on it. And then the one for the Moscow lab is literally stuff for electronic evidence after Bryan's arrest. There's no other lab warrants whatsoever on here. So if the rumor is true and they really didn't find anything whatsoever on the sheath the first time they tested it, that first testing would have been done by ISP, Idaho State Police. Then they would have sent it somewhere in order for there to have been a profile found that they didn't originally find. So is that if and when the Othram Labs was brought in? Because we haven't seen anything about that being where it was sent off for that portion of it. Now, once this DNA sample was found and they found that it was a male and they had all of their little markers and stuff on the actual reading of the DNA, then maybe that's when it was sent over to Othram Labs, and that's whenever they found the little family tree. We haven't seen anything when it comes to paperwork outside of them telling us that ISP basically did all of this by themselves, but the rest of the world is claiming that that's not true. Well, not the rest of the world, but the majority of people that are reading other things about this case and writing other things about this case are claiming that that's not true. And then it's not until 12/23 that they get the direct warrant for Bryan Kohberger's actual phone number, which is why it makes me think this really did happen and there really was all these other labs involved. And now we kind of know that there was this genealogical testing done because they're trying to exclude it. The prosecution and the defense side have both told us that this is a legitimately existing situation. So, how long have they known that this was an existing situation is the real question. 4 days later, on the 27th, is whenever they took the trash out of the trash can in Pennsylvania and flew it to Idaho in order for the ISP lab to then compare it to the male profile that they had in the system. Then on the next day, the 28th, is whenever the DNA was verified as a match to said profile as the father of the person responsible for the DNA left on the sheath. The very next day, on 12/29/22, is whenever both the arrest and the search warrants were written. And that right there is where I stopped the very long video, well, this one's long too, but even longer video that I mentioned to you guys in the beginning, and only released last night the information that I found on Don Daniels. Now, this is basically my thought process on this entire thing, okay? ISP, without a doubt, would have been the first agency to do any sort of anything when it comes to the evidence, because we know they're the ones who got there with Payne and Blaker and started processing the scene around 4 p.m. Now, if it is true that they originally did not find anything, it is normal process and protocol to make sure that these things are tested more than once. And we also know that agencies contract with outside labs and outside sources in order to get things done more efficiently if they cannot do it. So if it did actually get sent over to the Woodlands in Texas to this weird startup lab, and that's where the genealogical match was found, that's great. But we still don't know who would have been responsible for actually finding the sample. Now, ISP might have originally not tested it, did some different testing, had someone else come into their lab and perform different types of tests, and then it was actually found in the underbelly, I guess, of ISP being able to take responsibility, but they are not the ones that would have done the genealogical testing. They're just not. So at the least, we have one lab that we have no idea about. At the most, it could very well be a handful. We don't really know how many labs are involved in processing any of this stuff. And we know from the paperwork that we've gone over previously that even though this was a Moscow case, WSU, Don Daniels, did assist them in getting evidence and stuff done with Kohberger's apartment and his office, but they didn't do any of the testing. That's why all the paperwork on their inventory sheets had no on the logs when it stated that it needed to be tested or sent to the lab. Everything was no. Well, that's because they weren't going to be touching any of it. But ISP would have been the first place, and where it ended up and everything in between is what everyone is really trying to figure out, because they let this guy leave the state. They let him walk free for about a month after first getting his name on 11/29, and then did the most dramatically not recorded arrest scene that is probably bigger than any movie, because we're hearing there was more than 50 boots on the ground that day. That's pretty intense for there to not be any camera footage whatsoever. With all these different things that could have actually been in the cycle of all of this, and all of the processing times that I know these things take, and then transportation times to get things in between places, I can definitely state at least 95% that during those traffic stops, they might have had his name on a list somewhere, but they did not have his name pegged as the match to the DNA on the sheath. Not yet. But it's still so strange that they would just go to Pennsylvania on a what if. And that has to be because that genealogy sent them there. And if the genealogy is what sent them there, in order for them to then get the trash out of the trash can to do further testing, they could easily be causing themselves a lot of issues with the way that this is going down. And I know a lot of people are acting like this isn't a big deal, but to me it's a big deal, because if they did not have a genealogical match to a small family tree with a very specific name, they would have never went to Pennsylvania. They would have stayed local looking for this guy. I can say that actually without a doubt 100%. But that is my timeline for what I've been able to put together for everything. You guys, by the end of this video, I have reached over 15,000 subscribers. And again, I started this true crime journey with Kylie Rodney right after the interview with Sammy Smith that made everyone's heads start spinning. The fact that you guys are supporting what I am trying to do here means the world to me, and I very much appreciate you guys being here. See y'all.